Welcome, conversing listeners. What is the credibility of the faith in a time like this? The Rethinking Church Initiative is launching a new podcast called Credible Witness.
I'm Nikki Toyamasito, and this is Credible Witness, a collection of stories and wisdom from faithful people wrestling with and bearing witness to the credibility of Christian life today. Each episode is an invitation to listen generously and courageously to one person, navigating social tension and moral complexity, negotiating doubts, struggles, and fears, overcoming obstacles and pursuing justice, and living out the convictions of their faith. And every voice reminds us that the church is called to be a credible witness to Christ, a living reality of hope, justice, truth, and love.
It's a beautifully rendered collection of stories that reward a courageous and generous listening. So please check out our show notes for links to the Credible Witness podcast feed, as well as crediblewitness.us. I'm hoping that you'll subscribe today, and I believe you'll be deeply encouraged by the series of episodes to come. Thank you for listening courageously with me, and may God bless this new effort.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. I'm really delighted to welcome Brad Brisco as our guest on Conversing today. Brad and I have known one another for a number of years, and he's known to many people primarily through the work that he does as a person that's been involved in church planting. Now, even that term, church planting, isn't familiar to many people. Many people are simply living in a world where they don't even know this is all going on. But in fact, hundreds and hundreds of churches, perhaps even more, are established in the United States of all different kinds every single year. For over 20 years, Brad has been involved in this and is currently the director of multiplication strategies for what's called the SEND Network. He has a Master of Divinity and a PhD. He's a person whose thinking and writing has meant a great deal to me in the years that we've known one another, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome him today as our guest. Brad, welcome to Conversing. It's really great to have you here.
Well, I appreciate it. And I love listening to the podcast. It's been a blessing and a joy to listen to multiple episodes.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, we met many years ago at a conference, and you have been deeply invested ever since that time and before that time even in this work that is broadly called church planting. And some people are highly aware that we're in perhaps one of the peak periods when church planting is more common and more frequent in more places in the United States and around the world than maybe it has ever been. And at the same time, we're in a period where the church, as you and I think have come to agree with one another, in one of its greatest moments of crises. So first of all, how did you get into all of this church planting work? And secondly, why is it even going on at a time when the church seems to show such evidence that it doesn't seem to know what it's doing?
Yeah, great question. So how I got involved, well, I was actually in the restaurant business with my brother for 13 years. Got into that right out of college. I was 21 years old, and we went into the restaurant business together. And in the midst of that, we both actually became believers, and eventually got to the point to where everybody, all the leaders in the church, the very first church I was ever a part of, at that point, I was almost 30 years old. Everyone told me that if I was serious about ministry, we needed to sell our quote unquote secular business, and I needed to go to seminary. So I didn't have anyone telling me anything different. So that's exactly what we did. We sold our business. I went to seminary. And in the midst of seminary, I had a couple of people tell me that I still remember sitting down at lunch with this one particular pastor. And he said he felt like the Lord might want to use my entrepreneurial spirit for church planting. And just what you alluded to, Mark, I remember saying to him, I don't even know what that means. Like what is church planting? Now, again, this was over 30 years ago, but that's what we did. I started learning all about, what is this thing called church planting? And we eventually, when I say we, my wife and I, we planted a church over 30 years ago. And then that eventually led to training other church planters. And then now for the last over 25 years, I work for a church planting organization called the Send Network, where we just focus on resourcing and coaching and training church planters.
It's quite an amazing thing. I mean, it makes sense to me that we would certainly look at someone in retrospect like Paul and see him as a highly entrepreneurial person, right? He moved widely and broadly, and he moved deeply, for example, in his time at Ephesus. He loved, though, the nurturing of young, early congregations and trying to get them launched in Christ in a way that would be sustainable, whatever the particular challenges of their own context. So for you personally, what does it now mean? I mean, what do you think you thought it meant 30 years ago? And what does it now mean to you?
Yeah, well, and really over the last 30 years, for me personally, it's really about engaging the context where God has sent us. It's making disciples. It's gathering them together. I love the question you asked as we started here, Mark, about, do we even need more churches? And the way I usually would respond to that is I'll say, if by church we mean buildings, then no, I think we probably don't need any more of those. But if by church we mean communities of people really, I would say, living the ways of Jesus together, like embedded and incarnated into local neighborhoods, then for me, the answer is almost always certainly yes. So I sometimes ask the question a little differently. I'll say, do we need more churches, or do we need more ways of being the church? And to that, the second part of that question, I would say, yes, I do believe in a rapidly increasing missionary context that most of us live in the West. We do actually need more ways of being the church.
Right. And what are some of the reasons why we need that? I agree that we need that, and other people might, but when you think of why we need different manifestations or expressions, what is it that's the thing that really excites and motivates you?
Well, I would say, first off, there are just lots of nooks and crannies throughout our country there where there just is not an expression of church on any level. I think there's lots of different people groups. There's underserved communities where we need a fresh expression of really a gospel expression in those communities to reach into the brokenness in the city, to engage in mission in the city. And I just think there today, again, I use the phrase all the time in a rapidly increasing missionary context. I just think the more and more people are just less and less interested in the programs and activities of kind of the traditional church. So this isn't an either or, it's a both and, but I think we need to plant what I would call alternative expressions of church to reach those people that are connected to some faith community on some level.
Right. I think I may have told you before the story of being on an airplane when I usually am not very conversational on airplanes, and I had my headphones on, but the guy next to me was sort of getting settled and seemed to want to chat for a minute, so I had my headphones off. Just chatting along, I naturally said, what kind of work do you do? He said he was a church planter. He, of course, didn't know me from the Man on the Moon, so I said, oh gosh, that's interesting to hear. What does being a church planter involve? And he said, it's really not that big a deal. You just need a really good sound system and a good speaker. Now, of course, to you and to me, that felt like a horror. I fairly quickly put my earphones back on.
Yes.
and thought, this is too long a conversation for a single flight. So in any case, I know that's absolutely not your depiction of what church planting involves. So take us a bit into that. These alternatives that are authenticating the gospel, making visible and tangible the credibility of God's love and justice and mercy in the world. What does that look like? How do you even go about it from the most basic to some of the greater details that we'll get into in a moment?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And I'm kind of that story horrifies me.
Yes.
About the conversation you had with this potential church planter. So a couple of things I would say. First off, and I think I've shared this little statement with you. This is something that I tweet just about once a week, and I'll just say like weekly reminder. But I'll say within this church planting network that I work worked for over the last 25 years, a little phrase I say over and over and over again is I'll say, we need to help church planters think less like a pastor starting a Sunday morning worship service and more like a missionary engaging a unique context. So unfortunately, lots of church planters, when they say I'm going to plant a church or I'm going to start a church, it's really code word for I'm launching a Sunday morning worship service. So any church planting training that I do, there's two big frameworks that I always start with. One, the first one goes back to something that I ran across 25 years ago. Actually, it maybe closer to 20 years ago in a book that I know you're very familiar with that Alan Hirsch and Mike Frost wrote called The Shaping of Things to Come. And in that book, there's this super helpful image where there's these three boxes. And the first box says Christology, and there's an arrow pointing to the second box that says missiology, and there's an arrow that points to the third box that says ecclesiology. So in simple terms, it's just Jesus, mission, and church. Well, the premise in their book 20 years ago is they said that our Christology, or the way we understand the person, work, and ways of Jesus, ought to determine or at least influence the way we understand missiology or mission. And then the way we understand mission ought to determine or influence the way we think of church or ecclesiology. Well, the reason I think that is so helpful, and the reason why really almost all the training that I do with church planters, it's framed around those three words and those three boxes, is I think most church planters, they start with ecclesiology rather than the ways of Jesus and starting with mission. So yeah, I do lots of virtual training, and the training is organized around that. We always start with Christology, go to missiology, and then lastly, we talk about ecclesiology. So that's the first really significant framework. The second is I'm convinced that if most church planters, not all, but many church planters, the way I'll say it is they've been discipled by American evangelicalism and what I would call 50 years or 5 decades of church growth mentality. Now, there's a lot we could talk about there. I mean, there's actually a lot of very positive things that came out of the church growth movement, without a doubt. But I also believe that if a church planter has kind of been discipled by church growth movement mentality, there are certain foundational, what I would call paradigm shifts that probably some things need to be unlearned and relearned. Like they have some deeply held assumptions. And while I'm convinced there's probably 8 or 9 of these assumptions that need to be challenged, there are 3 particular foundational paradigm shifts that I always start any church planting training with. So very quickly, I'll just tell you what they are. The first one for me is what I just call recapturing the missionary nature of the church. So I want planters to understand that the church isn't a place where certain things happen, and the church isn't a vendor of religious goods and services, but instead the church is a sent missionary entity. So in other words, individually and collectively, we need to see ourselves as a sent missionary people. So that's the first paradigm shift. The second one for me is kind of the other side of the same coin, is what I just call incarnational presence. So bottom line for me on the second paradigm shift is we must allow the incarnation of Jesus to inform the way, kind of like our posture towards our context. So we are a sent missionary people, but then we need to embed or incarnate our lives and the gospel into a local context. So those are the first 2 paradigm shifts. And then the third kind of key paradigm shift, and for me, all 3 of these kind of cohere together. The third one I just call participation in the Missio Dei. So, very simply, for me, what that's about is the mission is it really ours. It's not about our strategies or techniques or human ingenuity. It's really 100% all about what God's already doing. It's about the mission of God. So our job is really it's just as simple as to say our job is to discover what God's already doing and then discern how does he want us to participate. So I don't know if that's helpful, but when I work with church planters, I want to try to kind of address these deeply held assumptions that most of the time they have if they've kind of grown up in an evangelical church in the United States. And I want to try to kind of break up some of those assumptions and hopefully see some paradigm shifting going on in the way they think and the way they behave.
Right. So let's go back into some of that. So for example, Christology, what do we think and make of Christ and his life and death and resurrection and the significance of that for the sake of the world? How do you help form people's Christology in a way that is a holistic understanding of Jesus rather than a individualized salvation for eternity vision of
Right.
Jesus that is disconnected from the social and economic and interactive realities of ordinary life. Where do you find people on the whole, and how do you move them toward a more, what in Latin America is often called a missio integral, a more integrated, fully holistic understanding of the gospel?
Yeah, that's great. Well, I use the phrase all the time. I just talk about a robust Christology, and this usually, like when training with church planters, this takes place over a couple of weeks because there's a lot here. But, a lot of times I'll ask planters, very early on in training, I'll say, what comes to mind when you hear the word Christology? And it's certainly in the tribe that I'm a part of, almost 100% of the time, they say the cross, and certainly the cross is central to our Christology. But I want to say yes, it includes the cross, but it's so much more than that. So there's this image that we use where I talk about, yes, it includes the cross, but it also includes the incarnation. It includes all the life and teachings of Jesus. Of course, it includes the cross, but it also includes the resurrection, the ascension, Pentecost, and the second coming. Like I would say all of that has something to say about the way we understand mission and ministry. And I would argue particularly the incarnation and the life and teachings of Jesus. Like, I think often about how have we, the church in the United States, how have we gotten away with thinking that it's okay to keep like brokenness or lost people at an arm's distance? Well, I'm convinced the way we've gotten away with it is we haven't really understood or embraced an incarnational perspective of mission. Like in our head or our minds, mission is something that we do over there and then we come back to our safe place, rather than saying that no, mission takes place where God has already sent us, that we need to incarnate into these places and take responsibility for those places. So it's having those sorts of conversations to where church planters recognize that, they live where they live for a purpose. God has sent them there. They work where they work for a purpose because God has sent them there. They inhabit the social spaces throughout the week because God has sent them there. And then to ask, well, what would it look like for you to actually take responsibility for those places and incarnate into those places, be in close proximity with brokenness and lost people and do life with people. And so all of those things for me just kind of flow out of particularly the incarnation and the life and teachings of Jesus.
Yes. So is this where then you would get at issues, for example, of that kind of painful evangelical individualism that often is really just about Jesus and me and assuring my, quote, eternity, as opposed to an understanding of Jesus as the one who is creating a community, first of all, so that it's never alone. And secondly, it's in this communion of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit and of God's people that are brought together into a new humanity. That's a very different understanding. I realize now we've slid over into ecclesiology in part, but I'm saying the two things between the Christology and the ecclesiology they are obviously deeply intertwined, or they should be deeply intertwined, and often aren't, right? So how do you? Not everyone coming to you, I assume, is thinking in the way that I've just suggested. So what does it take to not only do the 2 weeks of training, but to sustain and follow this deep understanding of what an extraordinary, surprising, shocking thing it is that God wants to involve us in the mission of the church or the mission of God in these really thick and amazing ways?
Well, yeah, I say all the time, mission is best done as communal activity. I mean, we can't mission, and there are certainly times where God will call us individually to engage in brokenness in our neighborhoods or workplaces, but it's best done in community. I mean, it is definitely a communal activity. So I think that's probably the first place where I'll start. And then I like what you said about the individualism. I mean, that's why I think it's so important to recognize this kind of comprehensive, robust Christology, because we've made the cross about individual application of the atonement. It's like, and the only question we ask is, are you going to heaven or are you going to hell, with that individual application of the work of Jesus on the cross, and to recognize that, all of this takes place in a community that Jesus formed. So, and I think maybe another way that's helpful, at least with church planters, is, another kind of framework that sometimes we'll lay over Christology, missiology, and ecclesiology. In really simple terms, we'll talk about engage the city, make disciples, and plant a church. So we really want people to engage their context, and there's lots of training, kind of individual engagement and corporate engagement. But then the next step from there is to make disciples. And those disciples, we want to form into some type of community. And discipleship takes place best in that communal space as well. So
Right. Yeah, I'm just so struck by, even going back again to the Christology, this whole sense of what it is that we've been saved, what we are being saved from, and what we are being saved for, and the way that Bonhoeffer comes along and, as you know, writes about the danger of what he calls cheap grace, which is a preaching and understanding of the gospel that is, let's say, 1 or 2 dimensional, as opposed to 3, 4, 5, or 10 dimensional. It's not a gospel that is for the whole of reality. It's a gospel for a more fragmented piece of reality, and therefore our faith and our actions are sort of separated. Faith is the main thing. Actions are sort of extra credit. And that's not a distinction, of course, that Jesus would make. Actually, faith is what leads us to action. And if the actions don't follow, then, as he says, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do the things I've instructed you to do? So I'm not here trying to call the church to perfection. I'm trying to call the church to what, in my language, is credibility, that we have brought these things together. And it feels, as an outsider to the church growth, to the church planting movement, an outsider in the sense of being a person who's not directly doing it, I just feel the urgency of the kind of vision that you have, and then the complexity of it around these questions of how do we make sure that we're holding together what Jesus never separated. And in this case, the grace of the cross, for example, and a life that actually lives the reality of the cross.
Yeah, that's why I think we have to start with Christology and move into missiology, and not allow planters to start with ecclesiology, because when they do that, it's about gathering people. I mean, scorecards get sideways. It's like how many people show up and how much money they give. But when we really do start with the person, I say all the time, person, work, and ways of Jesus, it influences the way we think of missiology. So then church planters lean heavily. I mean, if they've really, moved in that, I would say, proper direction, they lean in heavily into issues of justice, of, racial reconciliation and economic and poverty issues and immigration and mental health and issues of power and creation care. And they just don't get there if they start with church.
Right.
Because it's all about the gathering. So I just think, some of the things I want us to do, I want to see planters do differently when they gather. I've just seen that happen if we start in the proper place. If we really start with the ways of Jesus, let that really inform the way we think of mission into our unique context. And then the reality from that too, Mark, is, there's this phrase that Alan uses in a book called Permanent Revolution.
That's Alan Hirsch.
Yeah. And he says, mission is the mother of adaptive ecclesiology. Now, usually when I use that statement in training, I'll always say, let me say that again, because it's a little geeky coming from Alan, of course. But he says, mission is the mother of adaptive ecclesiology. So in other words, if we allow the ways of Jesus to inform the way we think of mission, there ought to be lots of wild and wonderful and beautiful expressions of church. But when we start with church, every church looks like every other church. So that's another reason why I love that progression of Jesus, church, mission, and then church, because that's when we will see fresh expressions of church being birthed in all these little nooks and crannies and these underserved communities and very expensive, center city, all across the country. We have cities that are just way too expensive to send a fully funded planter into them. So just all of these I just think there'll just be a wide variety of beautiful expressions of church when we move in that kind of proper sequence.
It strikes me that there's a need for church planting framework to be brought to established churches to help them reconsider their own mission. I mean, if you took the grid that you're suggesting of Christology, missiology, ecclesiology, and you came to a long-established church and you said, where are you on these three fronts? It would be illuminating, I would think, to have a church that was willing to ask the hard questions as though they were doing a church plant. How clear is our Christology and its fullness and implications? How mission does it make us? And therefore, what kind of church are we? Because, as you know, an established church has the gift and the burden of that package form, structure, identity, institutionalism, building, etc., governance, that can actually make the Christology harder and the missiology harder. So there's probably a work for some people to do just to bring church planting frameworks to established churches and to ask, what might we learn about ourselves?
I've had the opportunity of the last, 15, close to probably 20 years working with lots of existing congregations. And I do think those assumptions often are so deeply embedded, it's nearly impossible to see a church like really make a shift. I'll usually use the language of incremental shifts. Like I would say, look, if you've got 10% of the people in your congregation that are really engaged in God's mission outside the walls of the church, what if you could get that to 20% or 30% or someday maybe 50%? But rarely, if ever, does a church, really kind of make this transition from, to being like fully engaged in God's mission outside the walls of the church. But what does happen often is the opportunity to get an existing congregation, if they catch the vision for the need to start something new to reach people that they're never going to reach, it isn't a hard kind of sell to get them to be what I would call a supporting or sending church, to where they're actually supporting a church planter then to move into, a neighborhood or a network of relationships that they'll never reach.
Yes. Wow. So give us an example of a call that you might have had recently from somebody who is thinking about being a church planter, and they call you up and they are at ground zero, except from a sense of perhaps of faith, of curiosity, perhaps of conviction even, that maybe this is really what they're supposed to be doing. Give us a kind of generalized picture of who such a person is, what they're asking. I'm sure every church planter is distinct, of course, because that's just the nature of being human. But what general comments would you make about that? And then what kind of self-discovery journey do you seek to take them on in order to help them understand whether this might be a call?
Yeah, I would say I have a call, not every day, but at least 3 or 4 calls a week, and some weeks every day, of potential planters. Usually they come to me because they have a job in the marketplace and they feel like God's calling them to start something. So they've either read something that I've written online about being a bivocational or co-vocational church planter, or someone else has, pointed them in my direction. So typically there's somebody that has a primary calling in the marketplace. And like I said, they feel like God's calling them to start or do something. So they want to have a conversation there. Now, so usually there, we're going to kind of talk through what is that calling they have in the marketplace. Would it align well with starting a church? And then also I want to talk to them about just kind of the way they understand ecclesiology and the way they understand the form and function of the church. And I would say more and more conversations that I have, and again, this is partly because somebody's run across something that I've written online, they are thinking about church planting from a completely different perspective or lens than kind of a prevailing model of church planting, where, again, there's still lots of church planting that's taking place throughout the United States that is more of a launching a Sunday morning worship service. But the increasing number of conversations I have are with potential planters that know they want to do something different. So they either want to plant a church that looks different, or they actually want to start a nonprofit to plant a church, or they want to start a for-profit business to plant a church. They've got, again, I've used this phrase a couple of times already. They have an alternative expression kind of perspective, and they want to talk through that. So I would say that's kind of my sweet spot, over the last at least 15 years, is kind of this R&D side of church planting.
Yes. Well, and I think that, and I want listeners to particularly have their ears perked up about this question of how a person holds together both their marketplace work and ministry. So talk to us about what that model is and really what an urgent and wonderful place there is for such a thing.
Yeah, so I moved into a new role 10 or 12 years ago, where at that time we called it Director of Bivocational Church Planting. And I knew when I moved into that new role, one of the things that I wanted to do was change what I would call the bias narrative around bivocationalism. And that's for church planters, but it's also bivocational pastors that are in existing congregations. I just felt like, most conversations I had with someone around bivocationalism, their perspective of it was, for the most part, was negative. And even when I talked to bivocational leaders, they kind of saw themselves as second-class pastors or second-class planters.
If they're doing one job to pay the bills, as it were, and the other job to primarily carry out their spiritual giftedness.
Yeah, exactly. And I didn't like it. I just didn't feel like I didn't think it was biblical. It certainly isn't helpful to kind of have this negative perspective on it. So I remember, again, this had probably been 12 years ago, thinking there were a couple things I felt like that we could all be involved in to try to begin to change that bias narrative. The first thing is I felt like we needed to talk about the benefits of being bivocational. And if you want, Mark, we can come back and talk about that. I just think there are enormous missiological and financial benefits of being in the marketplace. But then secondly, I felt like that we needed to expand the language. So you'll notice I don't say change the language, but I felt like we needed additional language to kind of crack open the imagination of people sitting in our pews. So about 12 years ago, we started playing around with different words, and we landed on this word co-vocational. And the way I try to make a distinction between those two words, sometimes I'll say, think of the word bivocational. So I actually think the word bivocational gets in the way of what we want to see accomplished. So sometimes I'll say, think of the word bifurcate. To bifurcate means to take one thing and divide it into two parts. Well, unfortunately, I think we do that a lot of times when we hear bivocational, is we compartmentalize or we bifurcate. And lots of pastors that are bivocational, they'll say things like, well, I do my job over here, so I can do mission and ministry over here. And I remember thinking, that there's a sacred secular divide there in our understanding of vocation that I don't think is helpful. So I wanted to try to bring those things together. So I'll say, so that's when, like I said, we kind of landed on this word co-vocational. And I'll say, think of that word co-vocational. So C-O, comes from the Latin prefix com, C-O-M, which means to have in common. So think of words like co-author, co-pilot, co-laborer. Instead of bifurcating or compartmentalizing, it's really about aligning those things together. So I still use the language of both bivo and covo, but here's the nuance for me. A bivocational pastor or church planter is someone that has a part-time job in the marketplace that they typically see as temporary. So in other words, they hope, or their dream or aspiration is the church plant grows large enough that they can eventually leave their part-time job in the marketplace and focus full-time on the church. And I would say 2 thumbs up, like that's, Apostle Paul, Acts 18, tent maker, all of that. But for me, a co-vocational church planter or pastor is someone that has a primary calling in the marketplace that they never intend to leave. So they know that God's called or wired them to be a school teacher or an architect or an engineer or a pilot or a police officer, whatever it might be. They know God's called them to do that. But at the same time, they feel like God's calling them to start something. So I want to help them see, recognize, embrace the incredible benefits of being in the marketplace. But then at the same time, we have to, acknowledge that there are challenges, and the number one challenge is time. Because if you're working 40 or 50 hours a week in the marketplace, you can't plant a church the way we've historically planted churches. So that's actually helpful for me, because inevitably we'll have to talk about rethinking church planting and having a completely different kind of strategy or model for church planting. So again, man, there's a lot there, but I think that's, for me, the emphasis that I give, the phone calls that I receive from people that are thinking about church planting nowadays, 90% of those calls are somebody that has a job in the marketplace, and they want to talk to me about how do you plant a church when you have a full-time job.
And in that sense, co-vocationally, with the intention that they're going to stay in their marketplace job, whatever that may be.
That's right, 100%.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. It's very interesting to me that, in just anecdotally, that the number of co-vocational pastors that I know are particularly high in communities of color and less common in white communities. And there's a variety of reasons for that, historically as well as culturally and also just economically. But I'm curious if that matches your experience and any comments you have about that.
Yes, 100%. So first thing I would say is I never want to sound like this is something new. Unfortunately, it's something new in white evangelical church planting circles over the last, really the rise of the kind of attractional church planting strategy, seeker sensitive, all of that, again, church growth movement over the last 50 years. It's like we have to recapture this idea of bivocational and co-vocational church planting. In any other people groups across North America, this is just the way it's always been. And it's the way it still is today. So we need to learn from those different groups that are leading churches that are bivocational and co-vocational. So there's a lot to learn there. But yes, it's 100%. It's, in any other ethnic groups, I don't have to convince anyone of the benefits of being bivocational or co-vocational because they already know it. And it's just the way that they think about it. Now, there are times, though, that I still think there are like some ecclesiastical paradigm shifts that need to take place because too often they're working a full-time job in the marketplace and they're trying to lead a church like somebody that was fully funded by that church. Like, they're trying to do it all. And I just want to say to them, no, you have to think differently about church planting and you have to think differently about church and leadership in the church if you're working 40 or 50 or 60 hours a week in the marketplace.
Totally. So when you are calling people to move into this and they begin to test the waters, what cautions do they seem to express? What they might have a framework that's more classically bivocational. And as you say, there's a legitimate place for that. But when you're trying to help them also think about a co-vocational approach to church planting, what tend to be the reservations people have? So
the biggest one, again, the biggest challenge is always time, and planters use different language, time management, balance, healthy rhythms. And that's legit. I mean, to have healthy rhythms around their personal health, their family, doing a good job at their job and church. I mean, there's just so many plates, they're kind of trying to spin, but and to address that is, I always say it isn't complicated, but it's multifaceted. And there are three really large themes that I always try to address with planters to try to kind of overcome that challenge. The first thing, as I say all the time, is anybody that's involved in church planting knows it's always best to plant with a team. But if you're co-vocational, there is simply no other option. Like you cannot and should not plant a church by yourself.
It forces that issue. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's just no other option. You have to plant with a team. So I have a particular bias on what a church planting team looks like, and there's another whole virtual training that I do around cultivating healthy church planting teams. But that's a big one. The second one is, in most cases, I feel like we have to recapture what I would call a robust theology of work, because there's too many planters, and I have conversations with, and they'll say something like, I feel guilty about the amount of time I have to spend at my job because that's time I can't spend on the church. Well, for me, that's an indication of a need for a theology of work, because they don't see that work is good. Like God's created us for work. And I want them to see the benefits of them, how they're bringing blessing and common good to their community through their work. But then also, how can we begin to align what you're doing in the marketplace with this church? And then the third thing I would say, and I've already alluded to this a couple of times, is they just have to think differently about church planting. They just can't, you can't have a full-time job and plant a, program-driven, launch large, attractional church. And the reality is you don't have to, because if you are co-vocational and if your primary support is coming from the marketplace rather than from the church plant, you have a much longer runway. You don't have to worry about funding drying up from partnering churches or maybe a church planting entity. And I see that happening all the time with church planters that are fully funded. Mm-hmm. Like they'll start with really good motivations to really lean into the brokenness of their city. But, a year in, 2 years in, when they begin to see that funding is going to dry up, let's say at year 3, there's always this shift. It's like the elephant in the room. There's this shift to get tithing Christians to be a part of this fresh expression of church. So there's some sense of financial stability or sustainability within that church plant. But co-vocational planters, again, when they don't have to worry about support from the church for their salary support, it just changes the emphasis that they and the church plant can have on the work they do in the city.
Yes. I'm thinking of, having been a pastor of established churches, I'm thinking about the impact of this model in this way, that there are, in every congregation, I think, typically some people who are virtually working at the church, who actually have other full-time paid jobs. But the way that they volunteer and the depth of ownership that they take and the kind of gifts that they bring and the care and skill and sacrifice they bring can be really at least co-vocational. And it makes me wonder if they would have a fresh take on that role, if they were given permission to think of it again in this invigorated church planting like way, rather than filling a slot in an ecclesial bureaucracy, which is the way that sometimes those overworked, overextended volunteers actually feel. It's not really a full invitation to bring their whole giftedness to the table. It's more to kind of, quote, do what the church needs. But what you're describing as a church planter is to say, no, I want to be a church planter who is doing a fresh and new thing in light of the opportunity and calling of God, and I'm going to do it with a fresh community of people, and we're going to do this fresh manifestation of what being part of the community of God's people is about. I just think it's an interesting interaction between the two things, because you have people that are essentially co-vocational in regular established churches, but would never call themselves that. And they're not co-vocational in typical terms, co-vocational for the sake of church planting. Right. But for example, I can think of people who have been alpha leaders. Some people on the call or on this, listening to this broadcast, would be aware that alpha is an international movement that is a kind of evangelistic effort to help people think about the claims of the gospel and its implications for them and the world that they're a part of. It's been enormously globally powerful. And I think of people that have been consistent alpha group leaders in churches that I've been associated with or aware of, who really are, in a way, doing a kind of church planting as alpha leaders.
Yes, and that's one of the things my hope was this expanding the language of this co-vocational. It would call people out of the pews to recognize that, because so often, without that kind of language or without that kind of conversation, people think that if I'm really going to be involved in full-time ministry, then I've either got to be a pastor or teacher, like the shepherd teacher. And if I don't have that gift set, then there's no place for me. And, one of the benefits, I think, of being co-vocational is I think it actually gives planters like a respectability, or sometimes I'll use the language of street cred, with people in the congregation, because and again, as I've already said, this isn't an either or, it's a both and, but I just know there's people in the congregation that appreciate the fact that the pastor, even if it's a part-time job in the marketplace, that they understand what they're going through Monday through Friday. Like, that pastor knows what it means to have a boss, or to have a difficult coworker, or to have to, not be late to work. Right. So I say all the time, I think it brings great respectability or street cred with people inside the church. But maybe even more important than that, I also think it brings great respectability with people outside the church, because, at best, people are skeptical of a church. At worst, they're hostile. And, anytime we have a conversation with somebody new, we all know that inevitably they're going to ask, what do you do? And if you have to lead with, I'm a church planter, and in most cases, people don't even know what that means. It's like, that's the weirdest thing I've ever heard of. But if you can lead with your marketplace calling, it just creates opportunities for that, relational conversation to go on a little bit longer. So there's just I just think that's one little, almost like a missiological benefit when we have a primary calling in the marketplace. Absolutely.
Well, this stimulates our imagination in some great ways. Brad, you have an angle on some of the examples that are unfolding about, quote, doing church differently that not everyone has. So give us some examples of this is not like the traditional church that you are seeing unfolding. Contexts, activities, associations, engagement, whatever it might be.
You bet. Yeah. So again, to step back just a little bit, that's one of the reasons I love this conversation around co-vo, is that if somebody really is co-vocational and they have a full-time job in the marketplace, eventually it will force a conversation around thinking differently about church planting. And that's really those are the conversations. That's where I want to get to. So, I think first off, there's more and more church planters that are doing like smaller expressions of church. So different language that people use, house church networks, missional communities, microchurch networks. I actually, for many years, I lived in Kansas City, and I was what was called a church planting catalyst in Kansas City. So really focused on resourcing and coaching and recruiting church planters in the city. But about 7 or 8 years ago, we moved to the Tampa Bay area. So I actually live in St. Petersburg on the Gulf side of Florida. And one of the main reasons we moved here is there's a church here called the Tampa Underground. And if you're not familiar with the Underground, it is what I would call, it's the best example of a decentralized network of microchurches. So the Underground has been at it. They've been doing this now for probably close to 18 years, I would say. So they have a beautiful kind of proof of concept, but they have spurred on, I would say, probably close to 50 other networks all across the United States and Canada. But it's a decentralized network of microchurches. So every one of these microchurches, right now, I think there's probably around 160, maybe 165 microchurches in the Tampa Bay area.
And how many constitute a microchurch? How many people?
Oh, it varies. It could be as few as 10 and as many as 100. I mean, it just depends. So they use the language of microchurch because it's kind of a broader language umbrella that incorporates nonprofits, it incorporates some for-profit businesses, incorporates more of kind of like a house church. But I tell you, when I was first introduced to the Underground, probably 12 or 13 years ago, Mark, there were two things that really captured my imagination that would just give you a sense of what this is about. The first thing is that every single microchurch has a crystal clearly defined mission. Like a microchurch does not exist if it can't articulate what the mission is. And the mission, is all of these different aspects of issues of justice. And I mean, you could name any sense of brokenness in the Tampa Bay area, and there's probably a microchurch that is organized around that particular issue. So I would say probably 80% of the microchurches, their mission is a sense of brokenness, or it's like an initiative or a cause in the city. And then about 20% of them, the mission is a geographical neighborhood. So like if you ask that microchurch, like what is your mission? They would say it's this neighborhood, or it's this 8-block area. Or so that was the first thing that just captured my imagination. I love the fact that microchurches were it started with mission, and then they would say community discipleship, actually more genuine community discipleship, flows out of that missionary engagement. So that was the first thing that really captured my imagination. The second thing is they have this physical location called the Hub. And the Hub is like a suite of services that are provided to the microchurch. So whatever the microchurch needs, like if it's a website or marketing or a brochure or coaching or training or just anything, they'll do their taxes for them. They can fall under their nonprofit umbrella, whatever it might be. The Hub provides those services for the microchurch. So that's what I mean by it's a decentralized network of microchurches. So that's just one example of these co-vocational church planters. They're planting networks of smaller expressions, house churches, missional communities, microchurches. Other things that I see is there's more and more church planters, co-vocational church planters, that are starting nonprofits, and they're actually birthing a church out of the engagement that nonprofit has in a local community. That's also true with for-profit businesses. There's lots of church planters today that are starting businesses like coffee shops and roasteries and co-working spaces and CrossFit gyms and other really like crazy things. And they're starting these businesses to provide like financial sustainability, but they're actually birthing a church out of the engagement that business has in the community. So lots of just different, like I said, that's why I'll often use the language of alternative expression, is that there's just a different starting point. Now there's still making disciples, gathering people into community, but they just look very, very different than, again, kind of the prevailing model of church planting.
Right. Amazing. What does it take for a church to qualify to become part of this kind of, or is it a church, or is it just the leaders that have an idea for a church that become part of this underground network? Or do you have to be sort of established?
No, that's a great question. So as it relates to the Tampa Underground, there are some things. There's a covenant. There's some training that microchurch leaders go through. There's some coaching, that's kind of required. So it's pretty loosely held. I mean, now there are other networks in the country that I'm very familiar with that have a much more structured, kind of like a leadership structure. And so there's no one kind of right way to do this. I don't think there's different expressions, but as far as the Tampa Underground here, there are certain things that a microchurch leader has to engage with the network for that particular microchurch to really be considered a part of the network.
Got it. Yeah. So I can see when this is going well, how great and fascinating that idea is, because it cracks open all sorts of pores, you might say, through which interaction with people in their context, their ordinary everyday life, their physical proximity to things, or their subjects of interest or passions or whatever it might be. What happens in a network like that when something goes wrong?
Well, they do have governing elders is the language that they use. I mean, there is accountability. It also depends a little bit on, again, different networks, microchurch networks across the country do this a little differently. But at least with the Tampa Underground here, it's kind of up to the microchurch how closely tethered they are to like the centralized services. They kind of leave that up to the microchurch leaders. But there have been times where they've had to shut a microchurch down. And there's times where a microchurch kind of lived out its calling, over a two-year period, and it disbanded. And the people in that microchurch either started other microchurches or they actually became a part of existing microchurches. So, you do have to be like kind of okay with the organic, messy nature of it. Everything isn't, always clean, but
I'm not looking for any perfectly clean church. I was just curious how that works. And what about being multi-generational? How multi-generational are these?
Well, at least here in Tampa, very, very much so. I would say, a majority actually. And part of that probably just has to do with the mission that they're engaged in the city. It's also very much involved in kind of the center city part of Tampa. I think there's other networks across the country. They're probably less so, but the diversity of the underground here in Tampa is very high.
Yes. Because often in the house church movement, there's a difficulty. There's often a sustainable multi-generationalism in the first era of the church, but then to be a sustainable house church that keeps able to grow as families grow, as children mature, as kids get complicated. Sometimes that's an inherent challenge, but it sounds like each of these microchurches works it out in their own particular way.
Yeah, and that's why, and again, people, I don't care what language people use, but I do like the language of microchurch because it is a broader kind of umbrella word or phrase. And also, unfortunately, kind of the history of house church in the United States isn't always positive because it's kind of been a reaction to like the prevailing model. And that's the other thing that, man, I just love what the Tampa Underground does and the networks that they've inspired is when mission is the organizing principle, some of those other things just kind of take a back seat. And it isn't reactionary. It's really very proactive to do something about, a sense of brokenness in the city. So that's one of the things I just, when I was first introduced, man, I just loved who they were. I loved what they were about and just loved the way they engaged the city.
Yeah. It sounds like an amazing thing. I'd love to come and visit sometime and just sniff around and get the feel of how all this is working. It's really
and I would encourage any listeners, again, if they're new to that, they have an amazing website. You could there's actually two websites. There's one that's just the Tampa Underground it really tells the story of the underground here in Tampa. And then there's another underground network website that shares all these sister networks around the country. So I would just recommend go to the Tampa Underground website, and man, there's just a lot to learn about who they are and how they do things.
Right. You and I both feel the poignancy of this particular moment in our nation's life, both in relationship to the state of affairs of our nation as well as the state of affairs in the church. So as we finish our conversation, give us a couple things that are particularly on your heart and ways that we might, those who are interested might simply join in prayer for the concerns that you're seeing through the angle of your own ministry and work.
Wow, that's a big question. I would say, man, just a pressure kind of on my heart over certainly the last year and even over the last few years is again, just a return to the ways of Jesus. I just think, I think often and sometimes say to those close to me, I just don't, the only way the church can be engaged in some of the things that the church in the United States have been engaged in is just to be completely void of the ways of Jesus. So, a little phrase I've just been processing a lot lately, writing on some, haven't published any of this yet, but just the shift that I feel like we need to make from a gospel-centered perspective to a Jesus-centered perspective. Because I think sometimes we can say, we're gospel-centered people and actually miss the ways of Jesus. So I just think there's just a recalibration back to the ways of Jesus on a daily basis that all of us have to experience. So, man, that's just been a burden on my heart.
Yeah.
And then also
personal discipleship.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Actually
into the
being a
ways
follower,
of Jesus.
right?
That's
Mm-hmm.
right. Yeah, to really look at and ask, are we becoming more and more like Jesus on a daily basis? And does the church reflect that? Like, do we really see Jesus in the life of the church? And certainly we do in some places, but in other places we don't. And it's just, it really breaks my heart. And it's just, some days it's unfathomable. I just don't understand the chasm between sometimes what we see in the person working ways of Jesus and what we see in the life of the church today. So yeah, that's certainly been a burden on my heart the last several months, if not a couple of years, and just trying to think through, how do we call the church back to a closer walk with Jesus?
Right. Amen. Brad, thank you so much for your leadership and for your friendship over the years. Thanks for this exposure to something that I bet many of the people that are listening to this podcast just do not have an opportunity to see as closely as you've given us that window today. So thank you. And we'll pray alongside you with a reclamation in a certain way of personal discipleship that matters for the sake of the church and for the sake of the world. So thank you very much for your time and your reflections.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate the time.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.